So now we know how to get values with vModel. We also already saw that an alternative to that could be refs. Refs behave differently, but if you only want to read data once, they can be a great alternative. Now I will stick to vModel here, and I want to dive at least briefly into input validation. We already did some validation in the last course project, where we showed this error alert if one input was empty. And of course, that is something you can do. In your submit method, you can check all the values, and if some value doesn't satisfy some condition you want it to have satisfied, you can show an error alert. Nothing wrong with that. We could also validate certain inputs on every keystroke, or whenever the input blurs. For example, here on the name, we could watch for the blur event, so when the input loses focus, and then we could check if the value stored in there is valid, and if it is not, we could show the user an error message. Here's how we could implement this. We can add a blur listener to the input. Blur is a built-in event. And we could then trigger a method, validate input, for example, which we add to our methods down there. Here I'll add a new method, validate input. And now we could add a new data property here, username validity, which initially, let's say, is pending because we don't know it yet. The user didn't have a chance of entering anything. And here in validate input, we could then check if this username, so the data property which we're updating with vModel, if this username, once we trim it, or we already trim up there with vModel as you learned, so let's maybe do that, so that we don't need to do it again in the code down there. So we check if this username is equal to an empty string, which means it would be invalid. Then we can set this username validity to invalid. Else, we set this username validity to valid. It's no longer pending because now we know that it is valid. And with that, we could then, for example, go up to the input again and add a paragraph below the label and input where we say, please enter a valid name. And we only show this with the if user name validity is equal to invalid. So not if it's pending and not if it's valid. We could also add a conditional clause here to this form control. Let's say we add an invalid class if username validity is equal to invalid. So if that yields true, this invalid class is added to this div. And we could utilize this in our CSS code here at the bottom, for example here, to check if we have a form control div, which also has the invalid class on it, and then target the input element in there to give it a border color of red. And maybe repeat that rule here to also target a label and give that a text color of red to highlight the invalid input. And if we do all of that and reload, it initially looks fine, but if we click in there and then don't enter anything valid and click out of there, it gets this blur event, and hence we get our error message and our error styling. And if we enter something valid here and then blur it again, we remove that. And if we enter a bunch of white space, that also gets this styling because we have the trim modifier. And that's just one idea I want to give you. There are thousands of different ways of implementing validation, and you can also definitely implement it in a more flexible and dynamic way than I did it here. But it is important to be aware of patterns like this, since this allows you to build the user interfaces and user experiences you probably want to offer to your users. So that's it for now about validation, one possible way of adding live validation before something is submitted. Not that the other approach would be wrong, but just to also show this. Now let's see how we can build our own form controls.